Betrayal is bad. Betrayal with a loaded gun is worse. Blake Harrington had built his empire on trust, and no one embodied that trust more than Richard Kane, his chief of security. Kane had been with him through the ugliest corporate wars, the late-night threats, the stalking lunatics, even the unspoken assassination attempts that never made it to the press. He was the man who knew every blind spot in Blake's penthouse suite, every unregistered entrance to the Harrington Global Tower. And tonight, Blake realized he had been letting a fox guard the henhouse. The conference table reflected the city skyline behind Blake like a sheet of black glass, the lights of Manhattan smeared into streaks by the rain running down the windows. Kane stood at the far end of the table, jacket open, hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His face was unreadable, stone carved into human form. "You've been busy," Blake said evenly, fingers lightly tracing the edge of his whiskey glass. Kane didn't deny it. "You pay me to be busy." Blake studied him for a moment, his voice low. "I pay you to keep me alive, not to hand me to my enemies." Kane's gaze didn't shift. "I'm keeping you alive, Blake, just not in the way you think." The gun's weight on his hip seemed heavier in the dim light, and for the first time in years, Blake realized he might not leave his own office alive. The silence between them was a blade. Kane broke it first. "You've made some dangerous enemies, Blake. I've spent the last year cleaning up your messes, keeping your name off of obituaries." Blake's eyes hardened. "And yet here you are, working with them." Kane shook his head. "Working for survival. There's a difference." He stepped closer to the table, each footstep sounding louder than it should in the massive glass-walled room. "Marco Vellucci made an offer I couldn't refuse. Not for the money, though there's plenty of that. For leverage, for insurance." Blake laughed once, a cold, humorless sound. "You're telling me you sold me out to a gangster for my own good?" Kane's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you that without him, you'd be dead inside of a month. He's moving in on your operations. He wants your Dubai contacts. And if I wasn't here, you wouldn't have even seen it coming." Blake stood slowly, his hands resting on the table's edge. "If you think I'm going to thank you for betraying me, you've been in this business too long." Kane's hand shifted closer to his gun. "I don't expect thanks. I expect you to listen, because if you make the wrong move tonight, it's not just you they'll take out. It's your company, everything." Rain lashed harder against the tower's windows as the two men stared each other down. Kane's free hand slid into his jacket, producing a folded dossier. He tossed it onto the table, pages fanning out to reveal surveillance shots of Blake taken without his knowledge. Shots of him at home, stepping out of his car, even entering the private elevator. Each image was time-stamped, precise. "They've been inside your life for months," Kane said, "and you didn't even notice." Blake's hand tightened around the edge of the table, but his voice remained calm. "And you're their messenger boy." Kane's eyes flashed. "I'm the only reason you're still breathing long enough to call me that." He placed the folder back into his jacket, but his gun hand remained steady, unmoving. "I came here tonight to give you a choice. Work with them, hand over the files they want, or this ends differently." Blake stepped around the table slowly, each footstep deliberate, controlled. "You know me, Kane. You know my answer." Kane's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Then I guess this is the part where we stop being on the same side." And with that, Kane unholstered his weapon. The polished black metal caught the city's fractured light, and the betrayal was no longer a conversation. It was a countdown. The gun was now fully drawn, and Kane held it with the easy familiarity of a man who had carried one longer than he had carried guilt. Blake didn't flinch. He had been in rooms with worse men holding worse weapons, but something about Kane's expression made this moment heavier. It wasn't rage in his eyes, it was resolve. "So this is it?" Blake asked, his voice steady. "This is the moment you decide you're done protecting me?" Kane's tone was flat. "I'm still protecting you, Blake, just not in the way you'd prefer." The rain outside was hammering the glass hard enough to sound like static. Somewhere far below, a siren wailed, then faded into the night. The office smelled faintly of expensive leather and the sharp tang of gun oil. Blake took a slow step to the side, not toward Kane, but toward the far corner of the table where a crystal decanter sat. He poured himself a drink, the sound of the liquid filling the glass unnaturally loud in the tense room. You've been with me for 11 years, Blake said, swirling the amber liquid. 11 years of standing behind me in rooms just like this one, watching my back while I made enemies that would make your blood run cold. And you choose now to point a gun at me? Kane's jaw shifted. I choose now because I've run out of ways to keep you alive without you knowing the truth. Blake took a sip and set the glass down with precision. The truth, he repeated. Which is what? That you've been moonlighting for Marco Vellucci, feeding him my moves like some two-bit informant? Kane's eyes hardened. The truth is that Marco already owns more of this city than you ever will. The truth is that you've been fighting a war you can't win. I've been trying to make sure you don't get crushed in the crossfire. Blake leaned forward slightly, hands braced on the table. And the truth from where I'm standing? You're just another man who decided his survival was worth more than his loyalty. Kane's grip on the gun didn't tighten, but something in his expression did. If you can't see the difference between survival and betrayal, then maybe you don't deserve either. Kane took one slow step forward, the muzzle of his pistol never leaving Blake's chest. You have one option that keeps you breathing past tonight. Hand over the Dubai files. They'll let you keep the company. On paper, you'll still be CEO, but you'll answer to them. Blake's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. A puppet. That's what you're offering me. My title, my office, my view, but none of my freedom. Kane shrugged with the kind of cold pragmatism that only came from years of surviving bad situations. Sometimes survival is worth more than freedom. Blake's voice dropped to a whisper. Not to me. Kane's eyes narrowed. Then you really are going to die in this office. Blake took a step closer now, closing the gap between them to just a few feet. You know me better than anyone. Do you really think I'd keep something as dangerous as those files where you could reach them? Kane tilted his head, almost curious. I think you're arrogant enough to believe no one could take them from you. Blake chuckled softly. Maybe I am, but you're arrogant enough to think you're the one who could. Kane's expression shifted slightly, just enough for Blake to catch the flicker of uncertainty. Blake pressed on. You're standing here with a loaded gun thinking you have the upper hand. But if you pull that trigger, Marco won't protect you. He'll own you. You'll be just another piece on his board, and when he's done, he'll sweep you off it like you were never there. Kane didn't respond right away. He was weighing it. Blake could see the calculation behind his eyes. The cost of following through versus the cost of walking away. The rain outside had become a steady roar against the glass, not just a background sound, but an unrelenting drumbeat that seemed to mark the seconds slipping away. The city below was blurred into streaks of gold and red by the downpour, the streets reflecting headlights like a river of fire. Inside the boardroom, the air felt dense, too still, as if even the HVAC system was holding its breath. Blake's phone buzzed once on the table, sharp, brief, unmistakable. Kane's gaze flicked toward it for only a fraction of a second. But in this kind of room, in this kind of standoff, a fraction was all it took to shift the balance. Blake's hand moved with deliberate calm, not toward Kane, but toward the far edge of the massive table. His thumb pressed against a small, invisible panel embedded in the surface, almost imperceptible unless you knew where to look. A faint hiss followed, the magnetic lock hidden within disengaging with a whisper-soft click. Across the room, the private elevator doors opened in perfect silence. Two of Blake's personal security operatives stepped out, plain clothes, but with the kind of bearing that made it clear they were professionals who had spent years walking into rooms where violence was not a possibility but an expectation. Their jackets hung loose, concealing what didn't need to be shown. Kane didn't turn, but his eyes tracked them in his peripheral vision. His pistol stayed level at chest height, aimed squarely at Blake, but the angle of his shoulders shifted. Subtle, but there. Stand down, Kane ordered, his voice still calm, still carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Not gonna happen, one of the operatives replied, his voice flat as cut stone. They stepped wider into the room, separating, the polished floor catching faint reflections of the overhead lights. Blake took a slow, measured step forward, never breaking eye contact with Kane. His voice was low, but it carried through the room like a line drawn in sand. You've got two choices now, Kane. You can walk out of here alive, or you can find out exactly how much you've underestimated me." The rain pounded harder on the glass, as if the storm itself was leaning closer to hear the outcome. Kane's jaw tightened. For the first time that night, the muzzle of his pistol dipped. Not much, just enough for Blake to notice. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition. He knew the fight was no longer his to win, but Blake didn't stop. He closed the distance one slow step at a time until they were close enough to feel the weight of each other's presence. The gun was now pointing toward the floor. Blake's voice dropped to a near whisper, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be lethal. "You made a mistake tonight, Kane. You thought you could walk both roads, loyalty and betrayal, and survive in both worlds. But there's no going back now. Not for you, and not for me." Kane's expression barely changed, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed a storm of calculation. He holstered his weapon slowly, deliberately, never looking away from Blake. The gesture wasn't peace, it was acknowledgement. "This isn't over," he said, his tone flat but loaded. Blake stepped back, giving him space but not giving an inch of control. "You're right, it's just beginning." Kane walked toward the elevator, past the operatives who watched him like statues carved from muscle and discipline. No one moved. No one spoke. The elevator doors closed behind him with a muted chime, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm outside. Blake stood alone in the vast glass room, the city sprawling beneath him like a map of power and danger. He reached for his whiskey, the glass cold against his fingers, and took a long, steady drink. Setting it down with deliberate precision, he knew two things with absolute clarity. Tonight he had kept his life, and tonight he had kept his company. But both were no longer assets. They were battlegrounds, and the war had only just begun.